All right, so I'm going to go over the quiz. It is number 9 in your notebook. So if you want to do the quiz corrections, then for number 9 in your notebook on that piece of notebook paper, that is where you would do the quiz corrections. And then tomorrow when you turn in your notebook, that's when I will grade your quiz corrections with everything else. So your test is tomorrow. Your notebook is due tomorrow. So all of those assignments on the table of contents are due tomorrow. So please make sure your notebook is in order, ready to go. I also wrote down on the board right there, if you notice, those are the key concepts that are going to be on your test, right there. Those are the key concepts that are going to be on your test tomorrow. Tonight, I will make the test and then I will make a Kahoot for the test. So on Canvas, there will be a link to a Kahoot if you would like it to study. My plan is to make the test and then make the Kahoot based on the test. So it will be a very good thing for you to study, but since we're not doing it in class, you don't have to do it for your notebook. It's just if you want to do it, it'll be there for you, okay? All right, so let's start going over this quiz so that you can do quiz corrections if you'd like. All right, so number 1, based on the results of his experiment, Mendel concluded that the characteristics of pea plants were determined by the blank. Letter A says inheritance of alleles from both parents. Letter B says inheritance of alleles from one parent. C says relative health of the parent plants at the time of pollination. D, genetics of the plant's offspring. So basically what this question is asking you is, so Mendel did a bunch of experiments, and the basics of genetics and what he found is that you have dominant and recessive alleles, and how you get those alleles is how you determines your genotype and phenotype, okay? So the question is asking you, how do offspring get their genetics? How do they look the way they do, and how are they the way they are? How did that happen? So that happened because they inherited those genes from both parents. They did not inherit those genes from one parent. You have to have 2 parents participating in order to make an offspring. If you only have one parent, that is what's called asexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction is usually done as a last resort. Okay? So usually, if you do not have other organisms around to help you make a new offspring, then you have to resort to making an exact copy of yourself. But you do not want that, because in your population of your organisms, you want as much genetic diversity as possible. You want your offspring to be a little bit different than you and a little bit different from everyone else. If you are doing asexual reproduction, if you're just making a copy of yourself, that's not what you want. And that's not what we talked about in this unit. We did not talk about asexual reproduction. So we're not talking about one parent. We're talking about both parents. So you get one allele from one parent, one allele from the other parent. So you need 2 parents, and that is what's going to determine the characteristics of your pea plants. Relative health of the parent does not really determine the characteristics of the offspring. So that's not really going to help you determine, okay, where did it get its genetic information come from? It doesn't really help you. And then D, genetics of the plant's offspring. So if we're talking about a pea plant and we're wondering where did the genetics for this pea plant come from, it would not come from the offspring of that pea plant, because it's backwards. So it's not D either. So it's A, because you get your genetic information from both parents. One allele from one parent, one allele from the other parent. That is the basics, that is the foundation, the fundamentals of genetics. All right, number 2. Mendel's experiment with pea plants and seeds led to the formation of his laws of inheritance. Using the table below in figure 0, what is the phenotype of a pea seed with the genotype? And then we have this genotype. So we have capital Y, lowercase y, and then 2 capital S's. So our first trait, because we have 2 different letters here, we have Y and S's. So we're talking about two different traits. Our first set of traits is talking about the color. So we either have yellow or we have green. And what you need to remember is the difference between dominant and recessive. So dominant, if we have a capital letter, that is our dominant allele, that is going to dominate the phenotype. So whatever the dominant allele is, that is the characteristic that we will see. So if we have a capital Y and a lowercase y, if we have at least one of the capital letters, then we will see the dominant phenotype, which in this case is yellow. Our second part of our genotype is capital S, capital S. So again, our capital letters represent our dominant alleles, and as long as we have one of them, then we will see the dominant phenotype. But we have two of them, so we're definitely going to see the dominant phenotype. And capital S is smooth, lowercase s is wrinkled. So we're going to see the dominant one, which is smooth. So then our P plant is going to be yellow and smooth. So that's going to be C. Okay. Any questions on those before I move on? Number 3, which of the following is true about dominant and recessive alleles and normal Mendelian inheritance? So, dominant versus recessive. So, a trick or a strategy, you could say, a strategy that I highly recommend you guys do, especially when you go to take the EOC, because the EOC is designed to make you mess up. So the EOC, they're going to have a couple of answer choices that both of them could be correct if you sit there and think about it. You have to pick the best one. So what I suggest you do, especially when you go to take the EOC, and when we do our EOC review, we'll revisit this concept again. But what I suggest you do is after you read the question, go over to the margin or on a scratch sheet of paper, because I'm sure you're allowed to scratch sheet of paper. Write down a few notes or as much as you know about what the question is asking you. So then when you go to read the answer choices, you can refer back to your notes so that you don't get confused on what the answer choices are saying. Okay? So I'm going to do that for this one. Which of the following is true about dominant and recessive alleles and normal Mendelian inheritance? So I'm going to write down what I know about dominant alleles. And I'm going to write down what I know about recessive. Recessive. Recessive alleles. So what do I know about dominant alleles? Well, I know that they are going to be capital letters. And I know that my recessive alleles are lowercase letters. And I know that if I were to show the dominant phenotype, how would I show the dominant phenotype? I could either be homozygous dominant, so 2 capitals, or I could be heterozygous. So this is homozygous, and this is heterozygous. And both of those genotypes will show the dominant phenotype. Now for recessive, the only way that I'm going to show the recessive trait, or the recessive allele, the recessive trait is if I am homozygous recessive. If I have 2 of those lowercase letters, that is the only way that I'm going to show the recessive trait. Okay, so now I have all my notes. Now I'm going to read the answer choices and pick the best one. So A says that dominant alleles are always written as lowercase letters. Well, if I look, I already said right here that dominant is on my capital letters. So A is incorrect because dominant should be capital letters. B says recessive alleles are always written as capital letters. Well, that one is incorrect because right here I wrote down that recessive alleles are lowercase letters. So A and B are switched. So both of those are incorrect. Letter C and D are both referring to heterozygous genotypes. So I'm looking at this one heterozygous genotype right here. So capital D, lowercase d in my example. So for that genotype, is the dominant allele expressed in the phenotype, or is it the recessive allele expressed in the phenotype? Well, right here I said that in order to have the dominant phenotype, I could either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So heterozygous is only going to show the dominant phenotype. So that means that C is my correct answer, because D would not show, the recessive allele would not show up, because you have at least one capital letter. That capital letter is going to dominate the phenotype. So that's why C is correct. Number 4, Tara made the following model, figure 1 of gamete formation in pea plants, which is best illustrated by her model. So what I want you to do, anytime you're given a picture and asked basically, because this question is basically asking you, what is this picture showing you? What I want you to do is I want you to do the same thing that we did up here. So look at the picture and jot down a few notes about what the picture is showing you, and then look at your answer choices. So looking at this picture, we have a genotype here and a genotype here. This genotype is 2 capital Y's, saying that this pea plant is yellow, and this genotype is 2 lowercase y's, saying that this pea plant is green. Okay? So the other part of this picture shows that these pea plants are going to what's called undergo gamete formation. When you have gamete formation, that is basically telling you that those individuals are going to reproduce. They are making gametes for the next generation, for their offspring. When they make those gametes, those letters that are here, so those are our alleles, this part is showing you that our alleles are separating. Because when we are ready to produce offspring, we have to separate our alleles so that our offspring gets one from us and one from the other parent. Okay? So we have our genotype. These genotypes are going to make gametes, so they're going to get ready for reproduction. And when they do that, those alleles are going to separate so that the offspring are genetically different than themselves. Okay, so now let's look at our answer choices. So we have that this model represents the law of segregation, the law of dominance, the law of independent assortment, or a karyotype. Well, you should have been able to get rid of the karyotype automatically, because if you remember, a karyotype is a picture of all of our chromosomes, our picture of 23 pairs of chromosomes. So this is not a picture of a karyotype, because we do not see 23 pairs of chromosomes. So it's not a karyotype. So now we have the law of segregation, the law of dominance, and the law of independent assortment. All right. So if we have right here that the alleles are separating, this part is the law of segregation. So this picture is showing us the law of segregation because our alleles are separating or segregating. It is not law of dominance, even though, yes, you have 2 capital letters here. So yes, you do have a dominant phenotype and a dominant genotype. Yes, you do have dominance there. But if you picked B, then you are only looking at half of the picture. So you are only looking at this part. You are not looking at the whole picture. Because the whole picture, this part of the picture, is showing you that your alleles are separated. So if you picked B, you only were looking at these genotypes. But that's not the entire picture, so that's not the best example of the picture. So yes, you have this in the picture, but that's only half of the equation. The most important part of this picture is that these alleles are separating, which is the law of segregation. Also, the law of segregation, what you need to think of when you see the law of segregation, you need to think of monohybrid crosses. And when you see the word independent assortment, you need to think dihybrid crosses. So the law of segregation is very easily seen when you have a monohybrid cross. When you have one trait, so we have one trait which is color. If we're looking at that one trait, then it is very easy to see the law of segregation, that our alleles are splitting in order to make our offspring. if you see the word independent assortment, you need to think dihybrid crosses. Because when we have independent assortment, we have multiple chromosomes lining up in order to separate. And what independent assortment says is that these chromosomes are going to line up independently of each other. So, do we have chromosomes lining up independent of each other in this picture? No, we do not. So we do not have law of independent assortment. We do have alleles separating, so we do have the law of segregation. So anytime you see the law of segregation, you should think a monohybrid cross. There should be one trait being affected. If you see the word law of independent assortment, it is a dihybrid cross, you have two traits that are being affected. So because we only have one trait here, we're looking at the law of segregation. Does that make sense for everyone who got that one wrong? Okay. Number 5, what is the difference between monohybrid cross and dihybrid cross? So again, these answer choices are pretty wordy. I'm going to go off to the side and I'm going to write down as much as I know about those two crosses, and then I'm going to read my answer choices. So monohybrid cross means 1, dihybrid cross means 2. And what am I looking at when I'm doing these crosses? What am I trying to see? I'm trying to see the characteristics of my offspring, and I'm trying to see what is the possibility that my offspring are going to have certain traits based on the parents. So when you're doing a monohybrid cross, you're looking at one trait. When you're doing a dihybrid cross, you're looking at two traits. Okay? Your monohybrid cross is going to be a square with 4 boxes. Your dihybrid cross is going to be a giant square with 16 boxes because you're doing two traits. In both of these instances, I have to have two parents, one on top, one on the side. So that's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can answer this just having that information. So letter A monohybrid cross involves a single parent, whereas a dihybrid cross involves two parents. Again, for both of these, I have to have two parents. In every situation for this unit, we had to have two parents. You will never have just one parent because we're not talking about asexual reproduction. So we're not having a single parent versus two parents. So A is incorrect because both of them are going to have two parents. B, a monohybrid cross involves a single trait, whereas a dihybrid cross involves two traits. Well, right here I wrote down that mono means one trait and di means two traits. So I'm thinking that it's letter B, but I have to choose the best answer choice. So I have to look at all the answer choices to make sure that B is the best answer. So letter C says that monohybrid cross produces a single offspring, whereas a dihybrid cross produces two offspring. That is not true because your crosses, whether they are monohybrid or dihybrid, does not tell you how many offspring you can have. It only tells you what is the probability that one of your offspring will look a certain way. It does not tell you how many offspring you can have. So C is incorrect because when we're talking about mono versus di, for this example, our prefixes are talking about our number of traits. Talking about traits. Not number of parents, not number of offspring, but number of traits. Letter D, a monohybrid cross is performed only once, whereas a dihybrid cross is performed twice. So we have had in the past where we have done multiple crosses, one after the other. But that was when we had a parent generation and we did a cross, either monohybrid or dihybrid, and we wanted to know what does the first offspring first offspring. So we did one cross to look at, okay, what does the first offspring, what are the chances of that first offspring looking like this? And then we did a second cross from that first offspring to see, okay, what would the second offspring look like if it reproduced with someone who looked like, who had the same characteristics. So in this case, yes, we did one and then we did a second one. But it is not talking about this. This question and this answer choice is not talking about multiple generations. That is when you would do multiple crosses. It's if you are wanting to see the characteristics of multiple generations. But it's not talking about that. We're talking about one cross at one time with two traits. So that is why D is incorrect. One cross between two parents. A monohybrid cross is for one trait. A dihybrid cross is for two traits. So B is your correct answer. Your best correct answer. Any questions on those before we go to the back? So, on the back, number 6, which of the following is an example of a homozygous dominant genotype? So, homozygous means same. Dominant means that you have to have at least one capital letter. So, at least one capital letter. And if you need the same letter, then that means that you're going to have two capital letters. So if you are homozygous dominant, you need two capital letters. So which one of our answer choices has two capital letters? Only this one. Because this one has a lowercase, this one has two lowercase, and this one also has two lowercase. So the only time that you have two capital letters is A. That is your homozygous dominant. Number 7, using figure 4 below, what fraction of the offspring for this dihybrid cross will be recessive for both traits? So, what I saw was that most of you went ahead and filled in this whole chart, and some of you got confused because you did not realize that this is a capital X and this is a capital X. And so when you went to go write it in your boxes, either you forgot that they were capital and you wrote them as lowercase, or you did not see that they were capital in the first place, and so you wrote them as lowercase letters, so then you possibly got the answer wrong. So what I highly, highly, highly recommend is that you go ahead and memorize this concept, that both of these parents are heterozygous. So if you notice, they are two dominant, one recessive, one dominant, one recessive, two recessive. Both of them are the same, so these are two heterozygous parents. And this whole thing is a dihybrid cross. So when you have a dihybrid cross between two heterozygous parents, you are going to have the phenotypic ratio, because they're asking about genotype. But anyway, you are going to have the phenotypic ratio of 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. And what that says is that 9 out of 16 are going to be dominant for both. 3 out of 16 are going to be heterozygous. 1 for one trait and 1 for the other trait. So 3 of them are going to be heterozygous for the first letter and homozygous for the second letter. And then the other 3 are going to be heterozygous for the second letter and homozygous for the first letter. The important part to this is this last one. 1 out of 16 are going to be homozygous recessive. That is the one that you are wanting to answer the question about. Because these are both lowercase letters, and these are both lowercase letters. So where they meet is this very bottom right-hand box, and you only have 1 out of 16 chance of making an offspring that is homozygous recessive for your traits. So recessive for both means homozygous homozygous recessive. So if they want recessive for both, that means that your offspring has to be homozygous recessive. For a dihybrid cross between two heterozygous parents, you only have 1 out of 16 chance for that happening. So I really do think that this question is one of those questions that they ask every single year. So I really, really think that this question is going to be on your EOC. So if you can remember that two heterozygous parents in a dihybrid cross always make this ratio for the phenotypes, for the phenotypes, then you will quickly be able to answer that question instead of filling in the boxes and then possibly getting those boxes filled in incorrectly. Okay? I'm sorry, were there any questions on that? Did I explain this okay for those of you who got it wrong? Okay. All right, so number 9 and number 10. Number 9, I gave you a hint on the online quiz, so hopefully you got that one right because I think my hint was very good. But number 9 says certain traits such as height and skin color are controlled by the interaction of several genes to produce many variations of phenotypes. What kind of inheritance pattern is this? So several genes, the prefix several is represented by the prefix poly. Let me say that again. The word several is represented by the prefix poly. So then your polygenetic inheritance is going to be the one that is produced by several genes interacting together. And then number 10, what evidence in pea plant crosses supported Mendel's law of independent assortment? So again, anytime that you see the word independent assortment, what kind of cross do you need to think of? A monohybrid cross or a dihybrid cross? Anyone pay attention when I was saying that? Dihybrid cross. Very good, thank you. So a dihybrid cross, we have to think about a dihybrid cross because that is when we will see independent assortment. So we have to think of dihybrid cross. We have to think of two traits. So let's read our answer choices and let's see which one deals with two traits during a dihybrid cross. So when crossing true breeding plants, all of the offspring exhibit traits that are exhibited in the parents. So if you have a dihybrid cross, and you're talking about two traits, and you have a dihybrid cross, are all of those offspring going to exhibit traits that are exhibited in the parents? So let's go back to our heterozygous parents, our two heterozygous parents. Are they going to produce offspring that are always going to show a heterozygous phenotype? No, they're not going to, because they have the possibility of making a fully recessive offspring. So they will not always show traits that are exhibited in the parents. Sometimes they will show traits that are not seen in the parents. So A is not correct. B, when crossing hybrid pea plants, some of the offspring exhibit traits that are not exhibited. How do you say that word? Exhibited. Shown. I'm going to change it because I can't say that word. Anyway, so in crossing hybrid pea plants, some of the offspring exhibit traits that are not exhibited in the parents. So that one could be true because we just talked about it. We just said that some of our offspring could have traits that are not seen in our offspring. So it could be B, but again, I have to pick the best one. So I'm going to read the rest and I have to pick the best answer choice. Letter C, when crossing pea plants that differ in two characteristics, so I'm talking about my dihybrid, so that part's good. Traits produced by dominant factors always appear together. So if I have two traits, so let's go back to our Y and our S's. So if I have two traits, and let's say I have my heterozygous genotype, are my two dominant traits, are my two dominant factors appearing together? So is this Y, this capital Y, is this capital Y next to my capital S? No, it is not, because what independent assortment says is that your characteristics, your chromosomes, your traits are going to line up independently of each other. So they're not always going to be next to each other. So that is incorrect. So D, when crossing pea plants that differ in two characteristics, traits produced by dominant factors do not necessarily appear. So this one is correct because this is talking about a dihybrid cross that is showing independent assortment. This one is incorrect because when you cross hybrid pea plants, this is talking about a monohybrid cross. So both of these answer choices are talking about monohybrid crosses, but we are not talking about monohybrid crosses, we're talking about dihybrid crosses. So that is why D is the only possible answer choice, because it's the only one that is talking about a dihybrid cross where your traits are going to line up independently of each other when they go to separate. Yes? Are we about to leave? Yes. Okay. So that's number 9 in your notebook. So I will grade those quiz corrections if you did them. I will grade them tomorrow when you turn in your notebook. Your test is tomorrow. I will post things tonight on Canvas. Please study for your test. Please get your notebook in order and ready to turn in.